So before I begin, does anybody have any questions about anything pertaining to the course? Anything that comes to mind thus far? Let me tell you that I have not finished the grading of the papers. I'm almost done with it. I am short of 3 papers still, so you'll get them on Thursday. I was hoping to get them to you today, but you'll get them on Thursday. And the second thing I want to mention is that we did have a makeup class, and it was more than a makeup class because it was a lengthy class. It was 2 hours and 20 minutes. And so it made up not only for the class that we couldn't have during week 1, but as I had pointed out to you before, it's kind of an advanced makeup class for one lecture that you will not be getting in week 9. The Thursday of week 9 we will not be meeting, as I'm going to be overseas at that time. So I will attempt to make that available to you, but I can't promise it. I did record it, but it's not a professional recording. And I have to see if I can somehow put it on some site that you could access it from, but I can't promise that, as I said. So let me now remind you about where we are at this point in this course. This is, of course, week 7, and the subject for this week is communalism. I'm going to turn to that in a little while because I want to finish up with some thoughts about Basanti, and want to see a few clips, 2 or 3 short clips from that film. And I want to sort of in my lecture on Saturday, the makeup class, we looked at excerpts from the legend of Bhagat Singh, and we looked at some other kinds of visual material for those of you who were there. I know that some of you were not there. And I went over a great many things which are enumerated over here. For example, the whole history of hunger strikes, and the article that has been assigned to you by Niti and Iyer makes the argument that it was actually the hunger strikes which really made Bhagat Singh into a kind of a legendary universal figure in India. And we discussed, for example, the whole allegation that Gandhi could have done something to prevent Bhagat Singh from being sent to the gallows along with Rajguru and Sukhdev. So I don't intend to go over all of this again, but there's only one thing I didn't really talk about. I talked about the iconography of Chandrasekhar Azad, but I don't think I showed you the slides having to do with the iconography of Bhagat Singh. And I want to just mention a few things to you, one of which I had mentioned in class before, that ordinarily when you think of Bhagat Singh, I mean, you think of a figure from who of course comes from a Sikh family. In both Basanti and the legend of Bhagat Singh, you see him in his family setting. The father is wearing a turban, and ordinarily one would have expected Bhagat Singh to wear a turban, which he did in his younger days, but then he took on the fedora, and one of the reasons for that was, of course, it offered a disguise. And really the main iconographic representation of Bhagat Singh is with the fedora. So this is Chandrasekhar Azad. We did all of that, but this is what I mean when I speak about the fedora. So the figure on the right, that's young Bhagat Singh, approximately 21, 22 years old. He died at the age of 23, and there you see him on the left, seated on a charpoy, and this would have been there are actually chains around his hands there. He would have been seated on a charpoy probably in Lahore jail. And these are 2 of the most well-known representations that you find. But by far the most common image of Bhagat Singh that circulates in the public domain is the Bhagat Singh with the fedora. And if you remember the legend of Bhagat Singh, which I know that some of you haven't seen, but there is a particular scene in that film where one understands how he came to adopt the fedora, because when the British police were on the hunt for him, and he was looking for a disguise, so he put on this fedora dressed himself up as an English gentleman and was therefore able to evade detection. All right. And as I've said to you, there is a kind of a complicated sartorial politics that you can think about. Sartorial meaning having to do with clothes. Of course, when you think about all of these nationalist figures, this is another composition which shows Bhagat Singh at different stages. Top left as a very young boy, then moving into his early adolescence, well, actually sort of beginning of his college years, and then of course at the bottom left the two images, and the bottom right the two images that we have already seen, and here now his Bhagat Singh with the fedora once again. On the right is actually an official British document, and this has to do with putting him on trial and sentence of death and all of that. And this is the kind of print bazaar that circulates widely in India. We've seen that with all of these figures there is usually what I've referred to as a print bazaar print, market print that you would find in the marketplace, and here of course with the tricolor in the background. All right, so that's the iconography. It's a fairly confined iconography, unlike the iconography of Mohandas Gandhi, which, as I've said, permits of a great many more elements, and of course points to various, not simply various phases of Gandhi's life, but the vast range of activities in which he was engaged. Now, let me very briefly turn to a couple of scenes from Rang De Basanti, and I want to just have a brief discussion around a couple of those scenes, and then we will pretty much wind up with our discussion of this segment of the course, which had to do not just with Bhagat Singh, but has to do with the whole question of revolutionary violence, or the use of armed tactics against the colonial state, because when we turn to Gandhi, which is not this week but next week, we're going to find that Gandhi took a very different view, and of course some of that has already been anticipated both by the comments that I've made and by some of the scenes that you've already witnessed. So now Rang De Basanti, recall the context. I mean, it's a bit contrived, frankly, that context, and this was part of the discussion I had with the director in 2007 when we had a public discussion about this film in Hyderabad. And when I say contrived, I mean, of course, the film begins with this young white woman, and she's there pretty much throughout the film, who comes to India to make a documentary, and she is looking around for these figures who are willing to audition, because there's this diary that she has of her grandfather or whoever it is, where these episodes are described when he was a colonial official with these young men, and she's been struck by that. So she comes to India. There are a number of people who audition for it, and then of course she stumbles upon this group of young men who are friends, and that's of course what triggers off then the second narrative. So there are two narratives. One is a narrative of her making the film with them, and there are implications for that narrative, because then it becomes a film about present day India as well, the corruption in India, and the film in a sense is posing the question, what, if anything, of the spirit of Bhagat Singh survives in the country today, right? That's the trajectory. And then of course you have scenes purportedly from the time of Bhagat Singh himself, contemporary to him, late 1920s until 1931, and they're done in sepia, right? So there's the different tint there. They're not done in the usual color. So instead of using black and white, uses a kind of a sepia tint. That's the setting, and don't forget, as I said, that there are these questions which have to do with locating Bhagat Singh in the present. There are all kinds of convoluted strands there. I mean, let me give you a very simple illustration that Bhagat Singh was someone who comes from the Punjab. You know, the Punjab was divided. In 1947, when the partition of India took place, so the partition was both on the western frontier and, of course, in Bengal. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the principal exponent of the idea towards the end, at least. He's not the originator of the idea of Pakistan, but the person who becomes the main champion for the Muslims, the main spokesperson for the Muslim League. That Muhammad Ali Jinnah did not envision when partition, the subject of partition came about, he did not really envision that the Punjab would be partitioned. He simply thought that all of the Punjab would become part of Pakistan. And that's a complicated history in itself. But we're not interested in the history leading up to the negotiations. Why do I mention all of this? For the obvious reason that there is a kind of a divided legacy to Bhagat Singh himself. Then how do the Pakistanis think? You know, so sometimes there is the urge and instinct in Pakistan to appropriate Bhagat Singh, given his location, his moorings in the city of Lahore. And Lahore, of course, became a city in Pakistan following the partition of 1947. Many of the artifacts related to Bhagat Singh are now to be found in Pakistan. Many of the documents are found there. And of course, this is true of Sikh history. This is largely true of Sikh history too, that many of the holiest sites associated with the Sikhs are now in Pakistan. But on the other hand, as I've mentioned to you in a previous lecture, when I was discussing very briefly the Sikh religion and its history from Nanak to Guru Gobind Singh, at that point I pointed out to you that the whole idea of martyrdom, when we were looking at the notion of martyrdom, suggesting to you that the notion of martyrdom didn't really exist in Hindu India. This is something that comes either from Shia Islam or it comes from the strand of Sikh history, that there were a number of Sikh gurus who were martyred, right, at the hands of the Mughal emperors. Right? So obviously there is a history of conflict there between Muslims and Sikhs, and there's a whole set of interesting questions about what is the manner in which Bhagat Singh is perceived in a country such as Pakistan today. You know, so as I said, on the one hand, there is the instinct to lay claim to his legacy. He is a Punjabi, of course. On the other hand, consider the fact that Bhagat Singh, for example, was a staunch secularist, even a staunch atheist. And Pakistan is, for all practical purposes, it is an Islamic state, much in the way in which Israel is a Jewish state, you know. And one of the things we have found in Pakistan over the course of the last 70 years is that it has become increasingly more homogenized. It never was. Even though it was created as a Muslim majority state, at the time of independence in 1947, 10% of the population of Pakistan was comprised of Hindus. Today, Hindus comprise less than 1.5% of the total population of Pakistan. And they are, in many respects, an endangered minority, as is the case with Christians in Pakistan. So there are these complicated histories. And if we bring all of them into the mix, then we can begin to understand why there would be some degree of ambivalence about the legacy of Bhagat Singh in Pakistan. All right? But let me turn to a couple of scenes, partially because they are a very nice segue into the next segment, and the next segment, of course, is on the subject of communalism. I'm going to give you a long discussion about communalism, but let's first look at just a couple of clips over here from Rang De Basanti. Okay, why is it not switching to this screen? 1 minute. Let's see if this works. Yes. Okay, there's no volume here. Give me a minute.
Sorry, it's not showing up for a minute. Let's see if it shows up.
Please look after them when they arrive at Kokomo.
Searching.
Oh my God. I'm awfully sorry, I just want to leave. I thought it like this. Just say no more.
So this is a little ahead of where we want to be. Okay. So this is where Ashfaq and
I think it was the
Bismil have been taken into prison and they're being tortured. Okay? Yeah.
The torture didn't work. So we thought of other ways.
बेटा ये कलाम पाक है तुम्हारे लिए
बिस्मिल जैसे हिंदू अपने लिए अलग मुल्क हासिल कर लेंगे वो सिर्फ तुम्हारा इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं
हिंदुओं की आज़ादी नहीं हिंदुस्तानियों की आज़ादी मियां पर छोड़ क्या समझोगे तुम्हें तो आदत पड़ चुकी है इन अंग्रेजों की जूतों को चाटने की
Okay, so very small segment. You can see why I wanted to show it to you, because we understand that what the British were attempting to do was to sow division, right? And this division is going to be along religious lines, right? It's going to be, and of course we see that, and so this was not part of the legacy. See, I've insisted on that, right? That here I'm not speaking simply of Bhagat Singh. I'm speaking of the whole. And entourage is not the word, it's not an entourage that accompanies him, but I'm speaking about the whole company of people with whom he mixed. I'm speaking about the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, that this was an organization whose ideals held up the notion of secularism, right? And I think that, and when we're going to think about communalism, I'm going to turn to that in just a few moments, we're going to have to think also about its opposite, namely secularism. What do we understand when we speak about secularism? And we've had a discussion about this in this class before, but now I think we have to have renewed that discussion, particularly in the context of communalism. And when you see this, you see that of course this is not secularism in the traditional sense in which it's understood. This is a defiance on their part of the idea that these freedom fighters think of themselves first as Hindus or Muslims or Sikhs or whatever the case may be, before they think of themselves as Indians. And this itself was something of a novelty from the point of view of the British. I mean, the British always thought that there was a kind of affect about it. They always thought that there was a kind of a dishonesty when an Indian claimed to be an Indian before claiming to be a Muslim or a Hindu or a Sikh. And why this scene is so interesting is precisely because it puts forward this idea that one of the things that was central, at least to this strand of Indian anti-colonial resistance, was a staunch advocacy of the idea that we are defending not a Hindu homeland or a mother or a Muslim homeland. What we're defending is a conception of Mother India which is much more expansive, you know. And that those Indians who collaborated, so you can see that there is a trope of the collaborator here, as there has been in many films before. Certainly in Lagan there is a trope of the collaborator. So here, in fact, Ashfaq says very clearly to the jailer that, you know, you're just used to licking the boots of the British, you know, you're basically a slave, you know, right? So this is what I want you to keep in mind, is what is this particular dialogue of secularism and communalism, and as I said, we're going to get into that in just a few moments. But let me also turn very briefly to one or two more scenes, partially because it's important to understand the wider context of some of these movements as well. And it's just another 30 seconds before it begins, the next segment that we're going to move into, you know.
हथियार दुश्मन ताक में बैठा उधर और हम तैयार हैं सीना लिए अपना इधर खून से खेलेंगे होली कर वतन मुश्किल में है सरफरोशी की तमन्ना अब हमारे दिल में है.
So that HSRA, that's the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, that logo that you saw in the background there.
सर जो उठ जाते हैं वो झुकते नहीं ललकार से हाथ जिनमें हो जुनूं कटते नहीं तलवार से.
So this man you see there, the last clip there, that's Lala Lajpat Rai. Lala Lajpat Rai was a major leader of the nationalist movement. Well, I can actually just go back for a few seconds. You'll see that little slogan there, say Simon go back. Okay, just look for that. So Simon go back there was a commission that the British had brought to India. Now you remember that we're talking here about the late 1920s. Okay, late 1920s, the situation was that the nationalist movement is really at the helm at this point, and the British thought that they might be able to make some minor concessions, all right, some constitutional reform. So one of the things that they did, that's a Simon go back, and that's Lala Lajpat Rai there, over there. So what they did was they sent a commission. It's called the Simon Commission, named after John Simon, who was a British official. And the Simon Commission was intended to come to India and then sort of, after having meetings with various officials, come forward with certain proposals that would they hoped, ameliorate the grievances of Indians. In other words, make some promises about constitutional reforms, including a few more Indians in the administration of their own country, so forth and so on. So there was a call by the Congress to boycott the Simon Commission, partially because there was no Indian on that commission. And remember that this is the late 1920s, so of course Indian nationalists are saying that this is really absurd. The notion that you're going to come here and try to bring forward some constitutional reforms and not even consult us. How are you going to adjudicate the destiny of a country of 300 million without even taking any Indian voices into account? So there is this massive demonstrations wherever the Simon Commission goes. I mean, so they go to Bombay, for example, and they find that the streets are completely empty, or there are hostile crowds. In Lahore, there is a demonstration which is led by Lala Lajpat Rai, and the British are going to lead a lathi charge. So a lathi is what an Indian policeman still carries, by the way. It's a rod, a wooden rod, like a staff, and it's iron tipped. So that's what most Indian policemen carry. So there's a lathi charge, and in that lathi charge, Lajpat Rai's head is cracked. And he's going to die a few days later of his injuries. So this is going to become, and it's at that point that these young men decide that they need to seek revenge, right? And that is going to lead them on the path of assassination. Inqilab is revolution, Zindabad is long live revolution. So this is what I meant, the older scenes are done in that sepia tone, right? And of course this is a kind of a cinematic device that you do it in sort of blurred motion, because partly it has to do with the fact that you are now looking back at the distant past. The past is always blurred in some ways, because the past is always seen through the filter, right? Partly for that reason. And there are lots of important little things. I mean, for example, what this alerts you to, the newspapers, is the fact, and this is deserving of a lecture unto itself, that there is a print culture in India. Of course, there had been a print culture for a while, but we should not underestimate the importance of a print culture when we are looking at the history of nationalism. And certainly at this point in time, not only was there a flourishing print culture, but the British had to, of course, undertake rigorous exercises in censorship, because print newspapers in particular were the major mode of dissemination. At this juncture, I mean, there's no radio, there's no television, and this is one of the questions that I had visited in my lecture on Saturday when we looked at those nationalist prints, because the nationalist prints were one of the ways in which information was often disseminated. All right, so this particular scene that we looked at has, I suggested to you, a number of resonances, and then finally one last scene, and we will conclude this segment. And this is a scene about. Okay. So you remember this character, that when he first emerged in the film, he's a rabid Hindu nationalist, right? And he has a problem with Ashfaq because Ashfaq is a Muslim. And so this is where you see the kind of a communalism, but then you see that, of course, that once he agrees to play a part in this documentary, then he begins to inhabit that character, and then that character takes over, and he himself has now been transformed into one of the architects of this new kind of secular ideology of revolutionary action, right? So there's this demonstration. You remember the occasion for this demonstration, that the young woman, I forget her name, who's part of that group, her fiancé has been killed. He's a pilot, because these MiG planes are using false parts or cheap parts, and so there's a demonstration. And at that demonstration, a number of these people are going to be beaten up. But let's just see 1 minute of this segment. This is important, this scene, about 30 seconds. So he's coming back to his old haunt.
वहां पर इतने मासूम लोग कुचले जा रहे थे और आपने इन सबको रोका क्यों नहीं मिश्रा जी? तुमने अपनी सरकार के खिलाफ मोर्चा निकाला? ये नहीं हो सकता। मोर्चा सरकार के खिलाफ नहीं था, वो तो सच्चाई के पक्ष में था। हमारे नौजवान सेना में भर्ती होते हैं, देश के लिए अपनी जान तक दे देते हैं, और ये भ्रष्ट मंत्री उन फौजियों की जान की कीमत पर अपनी तिजोरियां भरते हैं, और हमारा पार्टी ऑफिस तो कुछ नहीं करता।
So when you see, by the way, if you look at the composition of this shot, I mean, for those of you who are familiar with the histories of Hindu nationalism, you can begin to see there's saffron is the color of Hindu nationalism, so that scarf that you see there, many of the young men will be wearing orange. That's, by the way, Hindu monks very often wear orange colored robes. And then you see the little trident there. So these are all the signs to the viewer that what you are is you're in the office of a party that stands for Hindu nationalism. So most likely something like the Hindu Mahasabha, for example, which is a party that espouses the idea not simply of Hindu supremacy but a Hindu nation, right? And so he's come to suggest to the leader that, look, that you were also complicit in the assault upon all of these protesters, and see what his reaction is.
ज़्यादा इमोशनल होने की कोई जरूरत नहीं है। राजनीति में भावना का कोई स्थान नहीं है।
पार्टी तुम्हारे बारे में बहुत कुछ सोच रही है, बहुत आगे जाना
You
है।
can see the saffron there. Yeah.
कोई मतलब नहीं है मुझे आपकी पार्टी से भी और आपसे भी, क्योंकि आप भी बिक चुके हैं।
Okay, that's enough. It happened. You get the gist of it, right? And this is what I mean when I say that this is now a very nice segue into the whole question of communalism, because the film that we want to turn our attention to, I don't know if we'll get to see any segments today, most likely not, is a film which looks at the whole subject of communalism. And our purpose now is to try to understand A, what is communalism? B, what is its relationship to secularism? And C, what is its relationship to nationalism? All right? So it's a triad here that we have to think about. And I want to begin with the question of what is communalism. So I had a brief discussion about this on a previous occasion in this class, but now we want to try to get a full-fledged understanding of it. And if you haven't read the piece by Gyan Pandey, which has been assigned to you for this particular segment of the course, you really must read it, because it is a piece that is of extraordinary importance in trying to understand the whole discourse of communalism. So would anyone venture to say what you understand by communalism? What is communalism? Carol?
Conflict between religious communities.
Yeah.
In the Indian subcontinent.
Okay.
In the country. I think only in India, not in related countries.
Well, I mean, communal conflict is as it's known, is something that you find all over South Asia. This is not. I mean, you could look at Sri Lanka. For those of you who've been following events in Sri Lanka, you know that what's happened recently in the last several months, the Rohingya, who are Muslims, have been driven out by the state. The predominant religion in Sri Lanka is Buddhism. There are Hindus as well, because there is a Tamilian population. So there's a population of Tamils, and most of these Tamils are Hindus, but some of them are Muslims as well. But then you have the Rohingya, who are basically a Muslim ethnic group. And incidentally, I mean, it's very important to mention this, because I think it will also help you understand that, notwithstanding the fact that we are looking at communalism in South Asia, that in many respects this is a problem that goes well beyond South Asia. So for example, it can be safely argued, and I think all you have to do really is also look at what's happening in Gaza right now. I mean, if you haven't read the news as of late last night, and moving into today, you know that there's been absolute carnage in Gaza over the course of the last 2 days, when the American embassy was relocated to Jerusalem, and we know that Trump's daughter has been there, and Kushner, and all of that for the occasion, right? Now, what's the relationship between all of this? The relationship is that in many parts of the world, I would argue, most countries understand that if you commit violence against Muslims, frankly, there are no consequences for you. There will be a hue and cry, some people will express outrage, and then it'll be quickly forgotten. It'll be quickly forgotten. That supposition is now part of the international order of things. And I know that in India, in 2002, when the Gujarat killings took place, in 2002, so, when I say the Gujarat killings, what I'm referring to is that the pogrom that was instituted against Muslims in the state of Gujarat, which is in Western India, the chief minister of that state at that time was a man who is now the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, right? Now, when this pogrom was instituted against Muslims, where 2,500 Muslims approximately were killed, 150,000 Muslims were displaced by the violence. It was partially on the supposition that frankly no one in the world would care. And the Indian government and Narendra Modi was entirely correct. There was a usual outcry, Amnesty lodges a complaint, Human Rights lodges a report, the US states we are unhappy at these developments, and then what you do is you simply ignore it. Okay, so this is a larger problem, and that has to do with the position of Islam in the geopolitical discourse of our times. Okay. Now, the interesting problem for us is this: that when it was said that it's religious conflict, well, there's religious conflict in the Middle East today. Right? There's religious conflict in the Middle East. So it's not particular to South Asia. Communalism has a particular meaning in the South Asian context. Right? So we would have to first begin with a different proposition. And that proposition is, how does one think of the question of identity in South Asia according to the British? Right? So if you take any person, you say that a person has multiple identities. You know, a person is male or female or transgender or cisgender or whatever. That's one identity. Right? They may be short or tall. They may be fat or thin. They may be black or white or Chinese or Japanese. Right? Those are all the rudimentary aspects of identity. And typically in a census, those are the kinds of identities. You know, when you answer a census question, the census question doesn't, you know, before they ask you anything about, you know, what profession, if any, do you follow, many census questions will not even bother asking you that, but they will ask you, which gender do you belong to? Check one box. Okay, which group do you most identify yourself with? Are you Asian or Hispanic or Caucasian, whatever the case may be? Right? And in some countries, they ask you your religion. You know, the U.S. Census didn't. The census in India did, but the census in India did not ask your caste for 70 years. They changed that in the last census. After many years, they decided to ask once again, what caste does a person belong to? Those are the rudimentary blocks of identity. Now, the British had the view that in India, before anyone is male or female, before they are short or tall, thin or fat, brown, black or white, they are Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Buddhist, Parsi, Jew. That in India, the colonial view was, religion is the primordial element of identity. Now someone might say, you should always, as an intellectual exercise, I'm going to suggest to you very strongly, this is a habit you have to cultivate. It takes many, many years to cultivate. And that is that when you think of an argument, always think about the rejoinder to your argument as well. And think of the argument in such a way that you think of the rejoinder and anticipate it in your argument. In Indian philosophy, that's called Purva Paksh, where you actually think of that and it becomes part of the argument. So what would be the rejoinder? If I said that this was a British view, that religion is the primordial element of identity in India according to the colonial view, someone might come along and say, oh, but isn't that the case in most countries? For example, doesn't a Christian think of himself or herself as a Christian first? Okay? What is so distinct about India? The colonial view is, yes, there is something distinct about India. It's not as though white people in Western Europe and America do not think of themselves as Christians or Jews, and maybe a few as Muslims, so forth and so on. But that this element of their identity does not predominate and define you. In India, it inescapably defines you. Inescapably defines you. That a Hindu who says I'm not a Hindu and I'm an Indian is actually lying. There's an element of deception there. Religion is the primordial element of identity in India and distinctly in India. And then there were other implications of that, such as the fact the colonial view also subscribed to the argument that there is a kind of a pervasive religiosity, that religion is the overwhelming fact of life in India. If you strip a man of his wealth and of his sexual prowess and everything else, but you leave his religion intact, he still feels intact. Right? That's how I would put it. Because in India, religion is the overwhelming fact of life. The British took that view. To understand communalism, we have to begin with that. Step number 2. In India, the individual does not exist. Now you might say to yourself, what does that mean? Well, yes, it means a lot. To make that argument, I'm not saying that the argument has any validity. I'm saying that I can understand the nature of the argument, even though I may not subscribe to it. So what does it mean to say that the individual does not exist? The individual is an atom of being. That the Hindu in India never thinks of herself or himself as an individual, but as a part of a collectivity. As part of a collectivity. Now every society is organized around collectivities, whether we like it or not. We know that, by the way, they're always loners. And you know that one of the favorite discourses in America is about, the serial killer, and next time you read an article, they'll always tell you he was a bit of a loner. I think I've read that about every serial killer in this country. Because the supposition is that then we can all just say, he was a loner, that explains why he went to Parkland School and shot 17 kids dead, or why he went to Vegas and, decided that he was going to fire, from a, 20th floor hotel room and just create mayhem. And then the experts will win and they'll tell you, he was a loner, The records show that he spent far too much time on his computer, looking at guns and, guns and girls and whatever, right? That's the standard discourse, right? But then otherwise we understand their collectivities, and in America the difference is that we choose the collectivity to which we belong. So if I like AK-47s, I join the NRA. I choose that collectivity. It doesn't choose me. In India, you don't choose your collectivity. The collectivity chooses you. You choose here to which group you wish to belong. Bruins for sushi. I belong to that group. I choose to belong to that. You understand? Because if somebody said, again, this is the Purva Paksh, this is where we are saying, somebody would say, yeah, but there are collectivities here too. And collectivities are hundreds of them. Men with certain disposition may belong to a private club. That's a collectivity. Men who like to play golf and don't like to have women coming to that, they belong to a private men's golf club. That's a collectivity. Right? People who love to shop in Costco and talk about their experiences as though it were something, miraculous or staggeringly interesting, they belong to that club. Right? These are all collectivities you choose to belong to. So that's the Purva Paksh. Yes. In India, the colonial view is the collectivity chooses you, and you don't have any identity outside that collectivity. All right? You see how communalism is not just about religious conflict. We are getting to something quite different here. That's step number 2, therefore. That in India there is no individual and there are only collectivities, and then 2A is the collectivity chooses you. And then 2B is the supreme collectivity is organized around religion. There could be other collectivities that choose you. For example, if you're a Brahmin, you are part of that collectivity of that group. and it may be a subgroup of Brahmins, it may be Nambudri Brahmins or Saraswat Brahmins, right? So forth and so on. There are hundreds of kinds of Brahmins, all right? Just as there are thousands of subcastes, right? Okay, so that's step 2. Now, let's get to step 3. Step 3 is that in order to understand the history of India, we have to understand that these collectivities, when these collectivities are organized around religion, which is the primordial element of the identity, so that will be the fundamental collectivity of which you are part of group, that these collectivities or these religious groups now are invariably at odds with each other. And I always give this example. I don't think I will tire of this example. I should, because I get tired of hearing myself talk about it, but I'll give this example to you because it's the most dramatic way of putting it. Take the cow. Now you know that among Hindus the cow is venerated, and the consumption of beef, in fact some scholars of Hinduism and some practitioners of Hinduism have gone so far as to argue that it may be difficult to describe who is a Hindu, but every Hindu has one thing in common at least. It is not the fact that they read the Rig Veda, because in fact most of them don't read the Rig Veda, most of them don't even know it exists. What is that one thing in common? A observance of the taboo on the consumption of beef. Just as you could say that one thing that is common to Muslims is, but there are other things that are common. For example, all Muslims subscribe to the Quran. Your interpretations can vary, but it is the holy book for every Muslim. There is no comparable holy book for Hindus. None. Right? Which is why the example of beef is very critical. That some, as I said, some scholars, and I'm not saying all scholars of Hinduism will make that argument, some have, that this is important. Okay? Now, here is the critical thing. That the colonial view was, look, we can say how different the Hindu and the Muslim are by looking at their attitude towards a cow. The Hindu loves to worship the cow, and the Muslim loves to eat the cow. He loves to eat the cow, and the Hindu cannot think of anything except venerating the cow. This was, from the colonial point of view, the sharpest way to define the difference between a Hindu and a Muslim. All right? So step 3 was, remember this is an illustration of what leads to step 3. Step 3 in the argument about communalism is that these communities, so Hindus will gravitate towards other Hindus, and of course there's a real problem with that, and Muslims will gravitate towards other Muslims. Why is there a problem with that? Because of course it assumes precisely that religious identity predominates over all others. I don't gravitate towards all Hindus just because they happen to be Hindus. What if they're Hindus for Trump? My God, I mean, I wouldn't want to, and there is such a group, by the way, Hindus for Trump, Or what if there were Hindus who said, oh, we belong to the club of people who love AK-47s, I don't want to identify with those Hindus. Right? But the communal-minded argument is, no, you're going to gravitate towards them because you're going to overlook everything else. You're going to overlook the fact that these other Hindus might be fascists or murderers or rapists or serial killers or whatever the case might be, right? Or simply stupid, but you're going to gravitate towards them because they're Hindus. And Muslims will gravitate towards all Muslims. They might be ISIS suicide fighters, but they're Muslims. And so therefore we rejoice in their company. Of course, there's an element of some dramatic exaggeration here, but that's precisely to make the point that there is this notion that people gravitate towards these collectivities simply on the basis of religious affiliation. And so step 3 here is that these religious collectivities are bound to be in conflict with each other. How can they inhabit the same world when the Muslim loves to eat the cow that the Hindu loves to worship? And of course, now what's the hidden assumption that guides all of this? That assumption is that our experience as Europeans allows us to interpret the religious history of India according to the template we are familiar with. Let me explain what I mean. I want to suggest to you, and you are at liberty to, of course, disagree and find me 500 sources which argue otherwise, but I want to suggest to you that the history of Europe is a history until very, very recently of religious conflict. That is predominantly what the history of Europe was. I mean, you cannot understand the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and the brutal conflicts even within different elements of Christianity, much less what Christians thought of Muslims. And of course, the whole history of the Crusades and all of that. I mean, it is a history of religious conflict. When the Europeans come to India, one of the consequences of their encroachment on India was the supposition that they could understand Indian history through the templates of their past. So they therefore deployed the template of their history, which was a history of religious conflict, and assumed that this was precisely the history that India had had. And this is exactly what we would have to contest. Okay? So now, therefore, what is communalism? Let us return to this question. Communalism is an ideology. It is an ideology which insists that the history of India is to be read through the lens of religious conflict. Here is a one-sentence definition. The OED doesn't have this definition. I'm giving you a definition you can think about. Right? Communalism is an ideology that assumes that you can read the history of India as a history of religious conflict, or through the lens of religious conflict. And so therefore, what is that scene that we just saw in Rang de Basanti, where he says to him, the jailer comes to Ashfaq and says, Bete, ye Quran le le, as it were. Son, take this Quran, you're a Muslim. Don't mix around with those Hindus. Don't mix around with the Hindus. Right? Because he's telling him, look, your destiny is with Muslims. So it's not simply, now we can see that the scene is suggesting something more complex. Whether the director knew it or not, I don't really care. But that what's being suggested is something much more complex. It's not simply a matter of sowing discord between Ashfaq and the other person. Within that organization, what he is doing is, he is using the whole template, the jailer, of that precise ideology of communalism, and suggesting, Ashfaq, you're a Muslim, your lot is with the Muslims. There is nothing in common between you and Hindus. Understand that. And of course the same argument will be made to the other person about the Muslim. In English there's a very simple phrase for it, but it simply cannot capture all the kinds of nuances. That phrase is called divide and rule. Right? You've all heard of it. But we can see that this is a more complex narrative that is at work when we look at the subject of communalism. Now let's try to unravel it a bit more before we turn very briefly to its relationship with secularism and nationalism. Right? We have to try to anticipate some of the objections. We have to do the Purva Paksha again. Because now think of the person who will say, what Vinay Lal has done is he's given this very rosy picture of this pre-colonial past when Hindus and Muslims merrily sang together, and everything was hunky-dory. No. There is no characterization. I am not saying that Hindus never thought of themselves as Hindus. By the way, I may be saying that too, because the word Hinduism is never used until the 18th century. No Hindu ever called himself or herself a Hindu before the 18th century. You cannot find a single text where a Hindu characterizes himself as that. They characterize themselves as Vaishnavas, as Shaivites, as Shaktos, as Tantrics, Kabirpanthis, Nanakpanthis, and so on. But let's, for the sake of convenience, say that Hindus did call themselves Hindus. Let's just, for the sake of convenience, so let's run with the argument. You know, the argument is not that Hindus and Muslims never had their own interests, because after all, if you have multiple identities, you sometimes think as an Indian, or as a white person, or as an intellectual, or as a plumber, whatever your profession, right? You think in all of these ways. And clearly there are times when we say that a person obviously thought to advance the interest of his own family or her own community. That would be par for the course, wouldn't it? The problem is when we begin to use that template to understand every conflict. So I'll give you a very simple illustration of how communalism is an insidious ideology. When I was growing up, and I still see it, but I see it to a lesser degree, every day when I would open the Times of India, I would find on page 5 or page 7 a small little news item. Okay? And the news item would be, in a village in Bihar, a Muslim person killed a Hindu landlord. Okay? Now, when you look at that, you say to yourself, the person in the West is saying, yeah, we knew that these people can't get along. Hindu, Muslim, they're always killing each other. Okay? But what is there to prevent us, when you hear that a Hindu landlord has been killed in a village in Bihar, you know immediately that the person who's done the killing is not just Muslim, but he's a landless Muslim. He belongs to the working class. Why is this not a class conflict before it is a religious conflict? That's what I would want to know. But you see, it will always be cast as a religious conflict. Because we know, for example, in Bihar and UP, we know that many of the landlords, the Hindus are better off than the Muslims. We know that the landlords tend to be Hindu. We know that the landless peasants, the sharecroppers, tend to be Muslims. Right? And so you could clearly say that this is an instance of working class rebellion. Or this is a working class person taking his revenge out on an upper caste person. But no, it's a Hindu being killed by a Muslim, according to the communal interpretation. Right? I hope that this makes it clear to you what I'm saying. So one objection is that this whole attack on communalism supposes that this was really the contribution of the British. And I have to say that yes, it was. And one doesn't have to come out from a position of Indian nationalism or Hindu nationalism to say that the ideology of communalism was unquestionably something that was promoted by the British in India. But to say that is not to say, let me reiterate it yet again, it's not to say that if you look at the pre-colonial past, that Hindus and Muslims never had conflicts with each other. They did as people always do, just as spouses do. There are always conflicts, or two people have conflicts over any number of reasons. And this is how we are to understand that pre-colonial past. It was also a past that was very syncretic in many ways. Right? Very syncretic in many ways. That is, that there were elements that were taken from each other's religion by the other adherents of the other religion. Okay? So this is what the ideology of communalism is, and Gyan Pandey, what he does in a brilliant demonstration of the invention of the communal discourse by the British, he looks at a whole set of incidents and shows how they are now going to be represented in British discourse. All right? I won't go over all the arguments because I've given you the fundamentals of it. Now you have to piece the rest of it together once you have this. Then you can begin to understand what he's really trying to say, because the typical instance where the British would say this shows that Hinduism and Islam are in conflict with each other, this is the nature of Indian history, is when you had what was called a communal riot. When Hindus and Muslims, so you saw that in Mr. and Mrs. Iyer. You see these Hindu extremists who board the bus, and then they begin to identify people by their religion, and if you're a Muslim, well, you're thrown off the bus or you're killed, right? Okay. So this is not a full-scale communal riot. In fact, this is not a riot at all, because a riot is when you have people of both faiths going at each other with hammer and tongs, right? And when you have communal riots, people are killed on the basis of their religious identification. Now, what Gyan Pandey does in the piece that was assigned to you is to show how the British came up with what he calls a communal riot narrative. Right? How do they start writing about it? So if a particular riot takes place in a little village or a town, so here he's looking at a riot that takes place in the major Indian city of Banaras, which was of course much smaller as a city in the early 1800s. When he's writing about Banaras in the early 1800s, he looks at how, this is the last point I'm going to make it, just to give you an illustration of the subtlety and complexity of Gyan Pandey's argument. He looks at how this particular riot or conflict that started in Banaras slowly over a period of time. Look at the table he has, where he looks at how the same incident is talked about in 6-7 different official reports. That 100 years later, this conflict is now written about as a conflict on an all India scale between Muslims and Hindus. So what's happening there? What's happening there is that a particular incident in a particular place at a particular point in time is now generalized. And what you have there is a contraction of time and space. Right? That is that contraction and expansion in different ways. So what is particular to a small place now becomes generic to the country as a whole. And what happened at a particular point in time is now seen as the eternal condition of the Indian past. Right? That's what he's really talking about. And this is the makings of a communal riot narrative, which is a communal riot narrative that is deeply steeped in communal ideology. Now, what is his relationship to nationalism? The Marxists had a very easy answer. And that is captured by the phrase that you find in Marxist writings. It's called false consciousness. False consciousness. In other words, the Marxist argument was that communalism is the false consciousness of nationalism. So what does nationalism require? Nationalism requires that the Muslims and the Hindus and the Sikhs and everyone else, right? Let's put the dots there. Buddhists, whatever. Buddhists, Jains, Jews, Anglicists, Catholics, Protestants, etc., etc. Right? The nationalist view says that all of them are conjoined together because there is something common during the struggle, and the struggle is that they all aspire to be free as Indians. They recognize themselves as Indians in some sense of the term. Right? That's nationalism. What is communalism? The communalism is where the Hindu, the Muslim, is misled into thinking. That's false consciousness. Is misled into thinking that his real interests lie not with the nation, but lie with his community. So that the Hindu begins to think, right, that my essential loyalties, my essential affinities are with all other Hindus. The Sikh begins to think the same. the Muslim begins to think the same. So the Marxist view was that communalism is a kind of false consciousness. Right? It leads the person astray, where he begins to embody a consciousness that is not his own. Now I'm simplifying it here, because then we can get into all kinds of permutations here. We can get into the Hegelian permutations, for example, the slave who begins to inhabit the consciousness of the master. If you've ever read Malcolm X, he gives you the most extraordinary demonstration of that you can think of. Malcolm X says that during the days of slavery, they always made a distinction between two kinds of Negroes. Right? Does anybody know the two kinds of Negroes that were the common distinction that was made? The house Negro and the field Negro. Right? Those Negroes who worked on the plantation home, worked inside the house. You ever seen Gone with the Wind, Mammy? Right? That person is a house Negro. Then there were those Negroes who worked on the fields, on the on the cotton farms. And Malcolm X says that the house Negro was always more colonized than the field Negro. The field Negro still was able to retain some degree of autonomy, but not the house Negro. And what's the example he gives? So in the Deep South, plantations next to each other, one plantation owned by Mr. Johnson, I'm just making up the name, the other one owned by Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell comes knocking on Mr. Johnson's door one day. He wants to talk to Mr. Johnson. So Mr. Mitchell knocks on the door and Mammy opens the door. And Mr. Mitchell says, "Is Mr. Johnson in? Is the master in?" Mr. Johnson happens to be sick that day. And what does Mammy say? She says, "We sick." We sick. Not he's sick. If he is sick, I'm sick too. I can't even think of myself as having an identity distinct from that of the master. That's when you begin to embody the consciousness of someone else, not your own. You can see false consciousness in that spectrum if you want to. I'm giving you different openings. That's what I'm doing. If you're trying to get a grip on this idea, right? Where the interests of someone else become your interests, and you don't recognize what your own interests are, what your own identity is. And this is, of course, why, among many other reasons, why Malcolm was called Malcolm X. Why he chose to call himself Malcolm X. Because every slave in this country received the name of their white owner. And to take the name of your owner was to take the name, not simply the name of someone else, it was to take on the identity of that person. He's Malcolm Little, he calls himself Malcolm X. X is that, and of course that's also because slaves were divorced from their histories, torn from their families, so he used X, which is, by the way, mathematics students, right? It's what you use to denote an unknown number, factor, in algebra, right? Malcolm X. That's the history. Now you understand what the relationship is between communalism and nationalism according to this line of thinking. We haven't exhausted the subject, but I'm not going to try to do that because we'll have to spend a lot of time just giving you some openings into trying to understand. And then finally, the last thing, and that is a relationship between communalism and secularism. And we've visited this question before. But it's important to revisit again and to reiterate a few points. Because recall that in the common understanding of secularism, which is derived from the experience of the French, and then becomes part of the common language of the West, meaning Western Europe and the United States and a few white dominant countries such as Canada and Australia, right? And that predominant definition is the idea of the separation of church and state. That secularism is that the state shall have nothing to do with affairs of religion. And in the United States Constitution, this is very often embodied in what is called the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. Right? That the state shall do nothing, very briefly, to do anything by way of assisting in the establishment of a religion. And of course, you know my position on it, that I don't think that the US is actually a secular country, but we don't need to entertain that proposition. You can ignore that. The important point is that in India there was a variant on that notion of secularism. And that variant is not simply that the separation of church and state, okay, but rather that the state shall do nothing to promote one religion over another. It shall not favor one religion over another. And I think I gave in this class the example that this is one reason why we have so many holidays in India. You know, I mean, there's so many religions and each of them has their guru, you know, their God, their Allah, their Bhagwan. I mean, it's endless, you know. I mean, if you allowed this to flourish, I mean, India would be on vacation half the time, you know. But there's already 2 holidays for the Muslims when they have the Eid. Christmas is a holiday, Holi, Diwali, Guru Nanak's birthday, Mahavir Jayanti. Mahavir is founder of Jainism. Buddha Jayanti, the birthday of Buddha, you name it. Because after all, if you give a holiday to the Buddhists and don't give it to anyone else, you know, then there's going to be a hue and cry over that. Right? I mean, I find it remarkable that in the US you can actually get away with having Christmas as a holiday, but Diwali is not a holiday, Eid is not a holiday, you know. And then I've heard people say, yeah, but that's because their numbers were so small. But how many Christians are there in India? I mean, they're 2% of the population. I mean, it's not like there are billions and billions of Christians, you know, but that's it. That's the difference. There is that variation. And so now, of course, the argument is that the real opposition is between communalism and secularism. Do I agree with that? I do not. I do not. Why? Because we'll have to understand secularism in a different way. And I want to propose a third way now of understanding. That might be the opposition to communalism, if there is truly an opposition to communalism. What is that third way? See, remember, the first way is, the first understanding of secularism is you divorce the two, church and state, okay? Or what you might describe as a kind of an indifference. That kind of secularism is probably closer to non-belief, closer to it, okay? Then there is a variation that all religions are equal and all religions shall be treated equally. Now there is a particular view that someone like Mohandas Gandhi had. And that view was that it is only when you are the practitioner of your own faith, only then can you actually be a real secularist. Okay? So I want to explain to you that, for example, and from each of the three so-called, if you're looking at the traditional periodization of history, what is a traditional periodization? Ancient, right? And then what's in the middle? I've already answered the question. Middle, medieval, right? Right? Ancient, medieval, and modern, right? That's typically how you do the tripartite division, which has its own problems, but typically how you do that. Now from ancient India, who do we get as the great figure of religious tolerance? Yeah? Prashant? Who's the figure of great religious tolerance from ancient India? Huh?
Akbar.
Akbar, did you say?
Yeah.
Not ancient India.
All right.
Ancient India.
No.
Someone. Anya. Blanking out. Okay, you remember for a second. And from the medieval period? Akbar. Akbar. Okay? Akbar. And from the modern period we know MG, Mahatma Gandhi. And from the ancient period, Ashoka. Ashoka. Right? But what's the most interesting thing? Ashoka was a devout Buddhist. Not Hindu, Buddhist. He's a devout Buddhist. Who was Akbar? A devout Muslim. And who is Mohandas Gandhi? A devout Hindu. And all three of them are the greatest practitioners of religious tolerance and what you might describe, if you can be anachronistic in this kind of way, as profound secularists. Why? Because each of them came to the view that the best way to be a secularist is to be a good practitioner of your own faith. If you're a good practitioner of your own faith, you will always have an ecumenical position towards every other faith and those who don't have a faith. This is what I'm saying. In other words, each of these figures derived their secularism, and I'm conceding the anachronism because, of course, can we really think of Ashoka as a secularist? But I'm conceding that anachronism and yet defying it by suggesting that we have to think of secularism in a different fashion. That each of them derived their tolerance, their ecumenism, from being a devout practitioner of their faith, not from being non-believers. Okay? And this was a model that Gandhi put forward. Now when you see, so I'm done for today, when you see Dharamputra, which is the film for this week, you think about all of these things. I've given you all the theoretical, historiographic, fundamentals that you need in order to be able to really come to grips with this film. So on Thursday, we look at some clips from this film and discuss them. Okay?